December 22nd, 1973. This has been sitting on the mail table for 2 weeks, Catherine Bowman told her son as she handed him the envelope. I was going to send it on to you, but I forgot, and then it was almost your vacation. Henry looked at the flimsy paper, Rhodesian stamps and postmark and airmail notices, then slit the envelope with his knife. The letter was from Raymond Johnson. November 12. Dear Henry, thank you for your swift reply to my request for 458 ammunition such as your uncle used on his safari in Angola in 1969. I realized at the time that you would need to know more specifics on the gun for which it was intended, but when I wrote the letter, I had not yet secured a specific weapon. I now have a Winchester Model 70 in this caliber. It is the old model with controlled feed, with a stock handmade out of a laminate embedded with epoxy so it won't end up a handful of kindling. I well agree with your assessment of factory stocks in this caliber, at least concerning the first decade of production. I believe the factory has made some improvements lately, as clients have used the new model without breakage, though the extractor system leaves me cold. Funny that you should be an Enfield man. I had a friend in New York 10 years ago who felt exactly the same way. Custom gunsmithing, metalwork at least being relatively hard to come by on this side of the ocean, one must make do with factory offerings and modest modification. The answer to your question about my chamber and throat is as follows. Overall length of dummy round with 500 grain Winchester bullet seated backwards, and still able to close the bolt, is 2.93 inches for my rifle. I am glad to hear that you are concerned about feeding reliability in my unmodified action and have a blunt projectile available that is not quite so square-ended as the ones Max used. I'd prefer to keep using my 600 Holland, but I am finally out of Kynoch ammunition, and there is none to be had anywhere. You could load for it, I am sure, but you'd need the rifle in hand to get the charge regulated properly. You asked about Rhodesia in your letter. It is a beautiful country, and I wish I had moved here earlier. The political climate would probably baffle anyone used to the U.S. system. Only South Africa recognizes the independence declared 7 years ago. The UN cut off Rhodesia. Because of the sanctions, Rhodesia is industrialized and self-sufficient. Not quite what the UN had in mind, I'd bet. Kind of like Colorado declaring independence and prospering after being cut off by the rest of the US, if you can imagine that. Maybe there's a lesson there. Another novel political notion here is that you have to have a minimum quantity of assets before you can vote. One effect of this policy is that the game hasn't been slaughtered to make way for collective farming. Thank God. Thank you once again for your help, and get over here on a trip as soon as you can. I waited until I was 25 to hunt Africa, and that was too damn long. Let me know what I owe you on the ammo. You'll have to check out shipping on your end. Ray. Henry folded the letter and put it in his pocket. As Ray had pointed out, no one was loading the big English calibers any longer. Thus, the few remaining manufacturers of double rifles, mostly Germans and Austrians, were chambering their arms for available cartridges. In dangerous game calibers, this meant the 458 Winchester Magnum, which was a smaller cartridge made for bolt guns. Loads designed for use in bolt action rifles produced about 55,000 psi of peak chamber pressure. Such pressures would overstrain the hinged action of a double rifle. The factories soon realized that their 458 ammo was too hot for double guns, and they reduced the powder charge to bring peak pressure down to the 40,000 psi level that double rifles could live with. Unfortunately, this also reduced the penetration of the 458 to where it was marginal on elephant and buffalo. Ray Johnson needs some full-strength 458 seconds loaded with flat-nosed solids, Henry thought. 300 ought to do him for a while. Henry thought about whether or not he had enough components on hand to load that much, or if he'd have to shoot up some of his 400 grain rock-busting loads to get enough empty cases. Then he remembered, too, 50 caliber cans full of fired, 458 brass he had put under the loading bench at the end of the summer. No time like the present, he thought, as he headed for the basement stairs. February 3rd, 1974. The regulated American economy, James Nelson said in a loud voice. This course is about government regulation of the free market. Much of the curriculum will focus on utility companies and other government-regulated monopolies. Nelson was an expert on industries that were most efficient when addressed by a single supplier. This department is known for its free market philosophy, so it may surprise some of you to hear me advocate government-sanctioned monopolies. He saw that he had their attention and continued. An existing utility company, the phone company for example, can double its capacity and serve twice as many customers for a fraction of the cost of duplicating its entire plant and equipment. A general rule of thumb for a single entity of this type is that capacity increases as the square of the cost. This is because most of the necessary hardware is already in place. Nelson paced across the front of the room and went on. This fact has been known for many years, but sometimes our legislators forget it. Years ago, the local decision makers realized Amherst was growing and needed more water service. They passed a law decreeing that there had to be a second choice for water service in this town and solicited sealed bids. They chose the company that offered the town the most for the privilege of competing in the water supply business. They didn't dig up the streets and put in duplicate water mains, Henry said reflexively. That's exactly what they did, Nelson said with a laugh. Care to guess what happened? No one answered. Mr. Bowman, is it? Henry licked his lips and took a stab at the question. The existing company cut their prices, maybe even to where they were losing money, and they drove the W guys out of business. Nelson smiled as he nodded in agreement. Then what? The professor asked. Well, I guess after the new company went bust, the old one was able to buy up their hardware, the pipes and all, for a few cents on the dollar, and ended up in an even stronger position than before. Right. And on top of that, Nelson added, the town subsidized the construction. It was 100 years ago, and they're still paying off the debt incurred by that fiasco. Can anyone tell me what was the one smart thing the town council did in making this law? He saw Henry grinning. Mr. Bowman, you look like you may have a suggestion. They were really smart to decide that there should be 2 water companies competing for everyone's business, and not 10. March 20th, 1974. James Nelson stared down at the term paper in his hand. He wished he'd known about it earlier. It would have made a good senior thesis, not just a midterm paper. The assignment had been to identify and discuss a case where government intervention had introduced a noticeable distortion into the economy. Most students chose tobacco price supports, the tax-deductible aspects of drilling for oil, or some other well-traveled area of government regulation with which James Nelson was intimately familiar and which had much in common with many other laws. Henry Bowman, by contrast, had selected a law Nelson had never heard of. Bowman had also claimed in the very first sentence that this law forced those it affected into circumstances entirely unlike those created by any other piece of government legislation. After reading his paper twice, James Nelson believed him. Nelson decided to do 2 things that were very unusual for him. The first was that he did not make a single mark on the entire paper, but instead put all of his comments on a separate sheet. The second thing was that he gave the paper a grade of A+. Prohibition's ugly legacy, 3-tier legal status, and 3-tier pricing caused by the National Firearms Act of 1934 as amended by the Gun Control Act of 1968. By Henry F. Bowman, Professor Nelson. Econ, 20, March 12, 1974. Introduction. A year after the 1933 repeal of Prohibition, Congress passed the National Firearms Act of 1934 and created a situation that was both unique and bizarre. The situation is unique because no other consumer good or manufactured product in the entire country is treated under the law in the same way that NFA firearms are treated. The situation is bizarre because under this law, 2 absolutely identical guns, consecutively produced within 1 minute of each other by the same manufacturer on the same assembly line, can fall into such drastically different legal categories that possession of one has the government's blessing, while possession of the other, even by the same person, merits a 10-year prison sentence. As if this were not unusual enough, a 1968 amendment to the National Firearms Act now prohibits the owner of the bad weapon, whichever of the 2 guns it may be, from placing himself in compliance with federal law. The National Firearms Act introduced a huge distortion into the free market for all guns which fell under its scope. The result is a threadier pricing schedule in the market for firearms regulated by this obscure section of the U.S. Code, as well as several legal questions which, to date, have not yet been resolved. This paper addresses a distortion in the free market caused by government intervention. It is not intended to be a political science treatise. However, in order to fully understand this distortion and how we got here, some history is in order. This is an unfamiliar area to most people, and it is quite possible that without a thorough explanation of the history behind current law, the average person would refuse to believe our present situation. History. The issue of owning militia-type arms to protect oneself and one's freedoms was not controversial in the early days of our country's history. It was taken for granted. All citizens of this country had this basic right. Prior to 1934, there were no federal laws regulating firearms ownership. And prior to 1865, there were virtually no such state laws either. All prohibitions and attendant punishment focused on violent criminal actions and not possession of inanimate objects. Two events changed the situation on a state level: the Emancipation Proclamation and large-scale immigration. Many lawmakers did not like the idea of foreigners and former slaves having the same rights as whites. They especially disliked the idea of these undesirables being able to protect themselves and control their own destinies. Legislators didn't want blacks being able to defend their freedoms either at the voting booth or by having guns. Because the Second Amendment guaranteed the right to keep and bear arms, and the 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection under the law, legislative creativity was required. Poll taxes and literacy tests solved the problem of blacks voting. Locking constitutionally protected black possession of inanimate objects required a slightly different strategy. One solution to the dilemma was to require permits to possess or to carry arms too. These permits could then be arbitrarily denied. Another answer was for a state to enact an outright prohibition on carrying weapons for self-protection. These outright prohibitions were then selectively enforced. The South Carolina legislature, perhaps pleased with the success of their poll tax, passed a law in 1875 prohibiting ownership of all firearms other than those manufactured by Colt or Winchester. Since these makes were much more expensive than all others, this law was a novel way to prevent poor people of all races from having guns. Immigrants got similar treatment. In complete defiance of the U.S. Constitution, California state law prohibited Chinese from testifying against whites in any court of law for a 20-year period in the late 1800 S5 in New York. Discussion urging the passage of the 1907 Sullivan Law made mention of how that law would make it illegal for swarthy immigrants to have guns. Texas gun restrictions subjugated Americans of Mexican origin too. All these laws, however, were passed on a state level. It was not until 1934 that any federal law was enacted which affected firearms possession. There is some disagreement about the impetus behind this law, as will soon be discussed. The National Firearms Act of 1934, the first significant federal gun law, was passed in June of 1934 with minimal fanfare. It attracted little attention because it only affected a small number of arms: full automatic weapons, machine guns, rifles and shotguns with barrels shorter than 18 inches, amended to 16 inches for rifles in 1958, and rifles and shotguns with overall lengths less than 26 inches. These arms now fell under federal regulation. In addition, any device designed or redesigned to muffle the report of a firearm, a silencer, also fell under the scope of the National Firearms Act, despite the fact that these devices were not and are not in any way, shape, or form firearms. Because of the Second Amendment, Congress realized it did not have the authority to ban these arms. Instead, the bill was slipped in as a revenue-raising measure under the Interstate Commerce Clause. Under the National Firearms Act, no person may transport, deliver, or sell in interstate commerce any firearm or silencer as described above, without first having in his possession a stamp affixed form for the firearm. The tax stamp must first be bought so that it can be affixed to the federal form when it is approved. For the form to be approved, the applicant must be fingerprinted, signed off by the local police chief, and submit to an FBI records check. The stamp referred to in the law costs $200. The owner of an NFA-regulated weapon must have this approved form, with the $200 stamp affixed in his possession before the arm or silencer in question may be transported in interstate commerce. This $200 tax must be paid each time the NFA-regulated item changes ownership. Because of the size of the tax, the frequency with which it must be paid, and the method by which it is levied, the National Firearms Act bears a strong resemblance to the Stamp Act of 1765 to the power of 9. Being fingerprinted and forced to submit to an FBI investigation is unusual, to say the least, for a revenue-raising measure. To put this revenue-raising tax in perspective, in 1934, $200 was more than a month's wages for a worker building Model AS on the Ford assembly line in Dearborn, Michigan. 10 in the 20s, silencers sold for $2 in hardware stores, and Thompson submachine guns could be bought out of the Sears catalog for $125. The idea that levying a $200 tax on these manufactured goods would actually raise revenue is absurd. The demand for each of the items covered by the National Firearms Act was elastic enough that virtually no one was willing to pay the government an additional $200 for any of them. According to Treasury Department records, there was not a single tax paid registration in 193,411, and there was one in 193,512. Another consequence of the act was that new development of machine guns by individual inventors stopped overnight. Given that the vast majority of full auto weapons now in use were designed by private individuals, this is a serious issue. The U.S.'s foremost authority on machine guns, Lieutenant Colonel George M. Chin, has frequently described the act a devastating blow to American security, in that it has crippled all future military small arms development in this country, and will continue to do so until it is repealed. 13. After passage of the act, there were only 3 classes of people who continued to buy these goods. Large companies bought the weapons for strike control and other labor relations purposes. 14 police departments, the military, and special occupational taxpayers. 15 continued to buy, for they were exempt from the tax. Violent criminals continued to buy these weapons outside of legal channels, just as they had obtained liquor during Prohibition. This reality brings us to the next issue concerning this obscure federal law. Reasons for the passage of the National Firearms Act. In almost every published description of the National Firearms Act of 1934 is a mention of the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and a statement to the effect that the act was passed because machine guns were being used with horrible results by bootleggers and other organized crime figures. There are several things wrong with this claim. First, it is laughable to hope that people for whom murder is a standard business practice will go present themselves to the local police chief to get fingerprinted and pay $200 for the privilege. Similarly, it is ludicrous to think that putting legal restrictions on firearms will reduce their availability to those people whose entire livelihood involves finding, buying, transporting, selling, and delivering illegal goods. Second, the highly publicized incidents of underworld gangs machine gunning each other over liquor shipments stopped overnight with the repeal of Prohibition, which occurred a full year before passage of the National Firearms Act. Third, the act also affects weapons other than machine guns, rifles, and shotguns, with barrels or overall lengths below a certain minimum, are regulated by the NFA. It is very difficult to conceive of a reason why the owner of a shotgun with a barrel 1/2 inches long should be charged with a felony if he refuses to be fingerprinted and pay $200, when owning a shotgun with a barrel a half inch longer is no crime at all. To compound this utter absence of logic, under the National Firearms Act, a person becomes a felon if he affixes a piece of wood to the butt of his pistol, doubling the weapon's physical size, for he is now in possession of a short-barreled rifle, which is covered by the act. To make the final leap from the illogical to the ridiculous, the act regulates noise mufflers, which are not firearms at all. Hollywood, too. The contrary, the FBI has been unable to document a single case of a firearm silencer being used in a crime in the 7th, given that citizens fire upwards of 6 billion rounds of ammunition per year. 18. The inclusion of silencers into the NFA is one of the greatest contributors to hearing loss in the United States, and therefore must rank as one of the largest public health blunders of this century. The real reason for the passage of the National Firearms Act can be summed up in 4 words: expansion of federal powers. In 1934, 2 major changes had recently occurred in the United States. The first was that Franklin Roosevelt had initiated an exponential increase in the size and power of the federal government. The second change was the ratification of the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition. Let us examine the latter incident first. In the 13 years that prohibition had been in effect, there was a great proliferation of people involved in the illicit manufacture, importation, and distribution of alcohol. This in turn produced a tremendous expansion of the Treasury Department and the number of its agents. 20 with repeal, liquor distribution was done by legitimate businessmen, and thousands of Treasury agents were idled. Federal legislation levying $200 taxes on goods worth between $3 and $100 was guaranteed to promote non-compliance by the citizens, thereby giving former prohibition agents something to enforce. It is interesting to note that the original draft of the National Firearms Act included all handguns then in existence in the United States. Because of the handgun language, some of the strongest opposition to the original version of the National Firearms Act came from women, who were vulnerable to attack from stronger assailants and got the greatest benefit from being able to carry a small weapon for personal protection. The number of pistols and revolvers in the U.S. in 1934 has been variously estimated at between 30 and 100,021. Compare this figure with perhaps 1 million machine guns and short-barreled long guns that fell under the Treasury's jurisdiction in the National Firearms Act's Final Form 22. One can only guess at what would have happened if in 1934 the government had told every citizen to cough up $200 for each handgun he owned that he might someday want to take or ship across state lines. The removal of handguns from the National Firearms Act may explain the odd inclusion of silencers in the legislation. In the first third of this century, silencers were commonly available in any store where firearms were sold. The term silencer is in fact a misnomer. It was a trade name coined by Hiram P. Maxim, an automotive engineer who applied the principles of muffler design to safety valves, compressors, blowers, and firearms. 23. A silencer does not make a firearm noiseless any more than the muffler on a diesel truck exhaust conceals the fact that the truck is approaching 24 with the 1934 Act, making it a felony to transport common noise mufflers in interstate commerce without paying $200 each to the government. Millions of citizens were now in violation of federal law. Although the National Firearms Act stipulated a grace period where owners could register these weapons and silencers free of charge, the Treasury reported that a grand total of 15,791 registrations occurred in this period. 25. This indicates approximately 1% compliance. The 1934 Act was thus a huge success at turning millions of citizens into criminals. The National Firearms Act fit in perfectly with the systematic creation of government programs and deficit spending that Franklin Roosevelt immediately began to institute the instant he took office. The NFA was a model vehicle for the continued expansion of government power. It was arbitrary, that is the 18-inch rule. It gave the government sweeping authority over something very common. It focused on inanimate objects rather than criminal behavior percent. B. It levied draconian taxes on these objects, and most importantly, it created millions of criminals with the stroke of a pen, just as Prohibition had. A clear example of the fact that the National Firearms Act had nothing to do with crime and everything to do with government power occurred immediately prior to its passage. Senator Hatton Sumners of Texas, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, had been a virulent opponent of the proposed bill and had bottled it up because it did violence to states' rights. 26. On April 23, 1934, Roosevelt called Sumners into the White House for a chat. Sumners agreed to vote for passage 27, enforcement of the National Firearms Act prior to 1968. After the NFA was passed, sales of affected items came to an abrupt halt. Domestic firearms manufacturers stopped producing any long guns with barrels shorter than 18. They also quit making any pistols with lugs on the butt for shoulder stocks. Manufacturers of noise reducers, most notably the Maxim Silencer Company, went out of business entirely. After the short grace period, citizens who owned NFA-regulated items on which the tax had not been paid had several choices. The first was to pay $200 to the Treasury for each item. In 1934, no one did this. The second choice was to relinquish NFA, regulated items to the Treasury without any compensation. No one did this either. The third option, theoretically at least, was to avoid selling or transporting anything covered under the Act outside the state. The fourth was to disassemble the machine gun, short-barreled long gun, or silencer so that it was inoperable, and keep the parts separate. In the case of short-barreled arms, the owner could also replace the barrel with one of 18 or longer and have a legal functional gun again without paying $200. Short-barreled rifles and shotguns were produced in low numbers in the years prior to 193,428, but the same could not be said for machine guns. The Colt, manufactured Thompson, bar, and belt-fed Brownings had all been produced in large numbers and had been available on the civilian market for over a decade. Furthermore, 2 million American soldiers had been sent to Europe in World War I, and over half of these had served in combat units. These veterans brought home many war trophies, as they are called, with complete legality 29. Machine guns were a relatively new and interesting battlefield weapon in 191,830, and captured examples were brought home by most soldiers. A conservative estimate of the full automatic World War I weapons brought into the United States by the returning 2 million veterans is 1,031,000. Other knowledgeable sources place the figure at over twice that 32%. The Treasury Department decreed that owners of these weapons could either register them for $200 or remove critical parts, such as the bolt, from them, which would render them inoperable. In this latter case, the gun was no longer considered a weapon subject to registration and $200 tax, but rather a DUAT, which was the Treasury's acronym, sort of, for deactivated war trophy. When agents encountered an otherwise law-abiding citizen with a non-tax machine gun in his possession, standard procedure was to give him the choice of paying the $200 tax and registering it live, or removing the bolt and or other internal parts. As years passed, the economy improved, wages and prices went up, and the U.S. fought in 2 more wars. A few million more veterans returned home from World War II and Korea with a few million more war trophies. By the 50s and 60s, some citizens actually were paying $200 and getting tax stamps from the Treasury Department on weapons brought back from World War I, World War II, and Korea, and on newly purchased machine guns from the many manufacturers around the world. The Gun Control Act of 1968. In 1968, the National Firearms Act was amended by the Gun Control Act of 1968. This 1968 law enacted sweeping infringements on citizens' rights to purchase and own virtually all types of guns. It also introduced a sporting use test on importation of firearms and ammunition. If certain guns or ammunition were determined by the Director of the Treasury to be not suitable for sporting use, importation of them was prohibited. The fact that the Bill of Rights concerns the preservation of freedom and not recreation is ignored in the 1968 Act. A 1939 Supreme Court decision ruling that military weapons are constitutionally protected, whereas sporting arms are not 33, was ignored also. GCA 68 also contained language which modified the treatment under the law of NFA-regulated weapons. Since these provisions did not immediately affect nearly as many people as the rest of the new legislation, their significance was not fully understood at the time. Under the new provisions, all existing machine guns in the hands of U.S. citizens had to be registered with the NFA immediately, including DWATs. A 1-month amnesty was instituted where the $200 per gun NFA tax was waived. After this amnesty ended, however, registration of existing non-tax machine guns was prohibited. Registration of machine guns manufactured in the U.S. after passage of these provisions posed serious problems for citizens and created legal questions that have not to this day been addressed. First of all, among the millions of owners of live machine guns and DWATs, not everyone even knew about the 1-month amnesty before it was over. Second, of those who were aware of the 1-month grace period, there was a tremendous fear that the entire amnesty was a trap and the guns presented for registration would be confiscated. For this reason, only a tiny fraction of machine guns and DWATs were submitted for NFA registration during the 4th. The 1968 amendments to the National Firearms Act and the one-to-time amnesty completely ignored the fact that the act only applies to those weapons transported in interstate commerce. The 1934 Act does not apply to a machine gun owner who never takes his gun out of state. The 1968 amendments have placed such owners in the position where they cannot now comply with the law. An owner of a machine gun on which the tax has not been paid is prohibited by the 1968 amendments from paying the tax and putting the weapon on the NFA registry. This has created a situation not duplicated anywhere else in the entire U.S. Code. As an example of how this law introduces a severe distortion into both the economy and the lives of U.S. citizens, let us look at an example. A coal company heir owns a consecutive numbered pair of Model 1921 Thompson guns, serial numbers 1410 and 1411, which have been in his family in the same location since the mid to 1920s. In 1965, but this could be any year between 1934 and 1968, thinking he might someday want to take one of the guns outside the state, he pays $200 and registers one of them, either one, under NFA 1934. Just to be safe, he removes the bolt from the other, rendering it inoperable. Prior to GCA 1968, he was in complete compliance with the law. Today, the tax gun is completely transferable to other citizens, and the gun can change hands an indefinite number of times, providing police and FBI checks are performed, and $200 is paid to the Treasury for a tax stamp each time the weapon is transferred. Ownership of the non-tax gun, the one without the bolt, is a felony 35, and there is no provision in the law to allow the owner to place this weapon on the NFA registry. He can offer to pay $2 million instead of $200, and he will still be denied registration. Under present interpretations of the 1968 amendments, the 1921 Thompson without the bolt is contraband, and it must be surrendered to BATF without any compensation. A model 1921 Thompson is worth between $1,500 and $2,000 at the time of this writing, if it is transferable, 36. There is another serious problem caused by the 1968 amendments to the 1936. One test section of the 1968 Act prohibits importation of non-sporting weapons and ammunition into the U.S. This includes importation of U.S.-made weapons produced before 1968, but which were outside the country at the time GCA 1968 was passed. The exemption for this import ban is for military and law enforcement-related sales. Thus, a 1921 Thompson gun currently in England, there are thousands there, may only be imported into the United States by an agency of the U.S. government, a police department, or a special occupational taxpayer who may then sell it only to one of these two types of purchasers. 3. Tier legal status and pricing. The example listed above makes it clear that government regulation has created 3-tier status for identical manufactured goods. Machine guns made in the United States can fall into 3 categories. A. Fully transferable to any law, abiding resident 37 upon federal approval after FBI investigation and payment of $200 to the Treasury. B. Transferable, tax exempt to special occupational taxpayers, police, or government agencies. And C. Contraband weapons which may not be made legal. These 3 different legal categories result in 3 different prices for otherwise identical guns. To continue the Thompson example, a transferable mint condition 1921 Thompson now brings approximately $1,800 on the U.S. collector market 38. An identical gun recently imported from England and sitting in a customs-bonded warehouse will bring at most $150, for it can only be sold to police and government agencies, and these entities are not willing to pay much for obsolete 50-year-old weapons. What the third gun is worth is anyone's guess, for the only buyers for it will be those willing to risk a felony conviction. 39. Future of the National Firearms Act. The Gun Control Act of 1968, with its amendments to the National Firearms Act of 1934, is a recent continuation of the trend started during the Roosevelt administration towards more government and less freedom. Recent and current administrations show no sign of reversing this trend. When freedom is at odds with government policy, one of two things eventually happens: either freedom is crushed, or political leaders are forced out in disgrace and replaced with guardians of individual liberty. Conclusion: the National Firearms Act of 1934 is a bad law. Colonel Chin has said on many occasions that the 1934 Act is the single most devastating piece of legislation to this nation's defense ever enacted. From an economic viewpoint, the NFA of 1934 is a bad law because its tax is so high that it stops enterprise cold and distorts the free market. NFA 1934 is a bad law because it raises virtually no revenue at all, when a $5 tax and relaxed regulations might easily raise millions of dollars for the Treasury Department. The 1968 amendments to the 1934 Act are bad law because these amendments actually prohibit those people who want to pay the tax on their guns from doing so. These 1968 amendments have made criminals out of people with no criminal intent and give these citizens no option other than to surrender their property without compensation. These are the kinds of laws which led to the American Revolution. The National Firearms Act of 1934 should be repealed in its entirety. 1. There was a law enacted in 1920 which prohibited sending handguns through the mail except by law enforcement entities and required that a common carrier be used instead. 2. Laws of this nature were passed in many states at one time or another. Notable exceptions were Vermont and New Hampshire. 3. Many states, including my native Missouri, have such outright prohibitions. Such statutes rely on vague wording, such as Missouri's prohibition on carrying a weapon for protection into any church, school, or any other assembly of persons met for any lawful purpose. Emphasis added. This last item allows police to arrest blacks and ignore whites. 4. I have not found the actual text of this law, but there are many references to it in several publications. 5. Stanford Lyman, Chinese Americans, New York, Random House, 1974, Pete 71. 6. This phrase became a buzzword with many politicians who wanted to expand their political power and is found in numerous texts. 7. Many people have serious misconceptions of Texas law and think of that state as one where everyone carries guns legally. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is no provision in Texas law to carry a weapon for protection outside your home or automobile. Those who do are relying on the crony system to save them. NFA of 1934, Section 11. 9. On March 22, 1765, Parliament levied a tax on the colonists, newspapers, and legal and commercial documents, all of which had to carry a special stamp. The colonists formed the first intercolonial Congress, which met in October of that year to declare American rights and grievances, specifically concerning the Stamp Act. Parliament rescinded the Stamp Act in March of 1766, but coupled this rescission with passage of the Declaratory Act, claiming England's supremacy over America in all cases whatsoever. The colonists' rights and their insistence on maintaining them became the basis for the American Revolution. 10. About $5 a day, according to a conversation with Arthur Wilkes, who an assembly line worker during that period was. 11. New York Times, December 25, 1934, 12. New York Times, November 6, 1936. 13. Given that the most reliable U.S. designs now in use, 1,919 a 4, 1,917 a 1, A&M 2, MG52A, M2HB, BAR, M14, M1 A&M were all developed by private citizens, and the guns, with major flaws, M60, were designed by companies. Chin's comment cannot be disregarded. 14. You could not run a coal company without machine guns, is a quote widely ascribed to industrialist Richard B. Mellon. Other large companies with union problems, auto manufacturers for example, also purchased machine guns. Special occupational taxpayers are those who pay an annual licensing fee to actively deal in NFA-regulated items. 16. Al Capone, irritated at having 15 of his men killed in 3 months by Bugs Coran's North Side gang, arranged a trap. On his orders, a truckload of stolen whiskey was offered to the North Siders at an attractive price, with another truckload to follow if Moran was satisfied. He was, and the second truck was sent to a trucking warehouse owned by Moran. As this second delivery was being made, a car appearing to be a Chicago police vehicle pulled up. The officers lined Moran's gang up against a wall, and the North Siders assumed it was time to pay off the policemen. Instead, the men dressed as officers but working for Capone killed all 7 of them using 2 Thompson submachine guns. The date was February 14th, 1929. 17. Pillows and blankets have been used because they more completely eliminate the noise. Knives are also very commonly used as murder weapons. 18. Spokesmen for Olin Mathieson and Remington Peters state that these 2 companies produce over 2 billion rounds each for domestic consumption. With other companies and imports added in, the actual total is much higher. 19. Many European rifle ranges mandate the use of silencers for this reason. The actual increase in the number of agents is unknown. The Treasury's budget for this type of work in 1932, however, was over 10 times what it had been in 1918. 21 domestic production of handguns in 1928 exceeded 5 million units, given that firearms almost never wear out. The 100 million figure may actually be low. 22. This number takes known domestic sales and assumes that, on average, 1 out of every 3 soldiers returning from World War I brought back 1 machine gun. If the discussions I have had with World War I vets are typical, the 1 million figure is low. 23. Hiram Percy Maxim was the son of Hiram Stevens Maxim, who invented the first practical machine gun in 1884. No evidence has been found to indicate that the National Firearms Act was intended to single out the inventions of the Maxim family. It just ended up that way. 24. Noise reducers for firearms are less effective than those for engines, for 2 reasons. First, gas pressure in a gun barrel is much higher than exhaust pressure in a tailpipe. Second, a design for a gun must include a straight, open path from the gun's muzzle to the exit end of the silencer to permit passage of the bullet. A muffler for an engine may employ all manner of reversing baffles, diffusing screens, and serpentine pathways to redirect exhaust gases that don't contain chunks of lead traveling at supersonic speeds. 25. New York Times, December 25, 1934. 26. William J. Helmer, the gun that made the 20s roar, London, Macmillan and Company, 1969, P125. William 24th, 1934. 28. Ithaca Gun Company produced the auto and burglar gun, and Harrington and Richardson made the handy gun in modest numbers. Both are now collector's items. 29. Bringing home U.S. ordnance is technically theft of government property, but at the end of a war it is typical for a U.S. soldier to keep the weapon he carried in combat without comment from the authorities. Arms captured from the enemy have always, prior to 1968, been acceptable for U.S. soldiers to bring home. 30. World War I was the first major war fought with them. 31. Thomas J. Fleming in a phone conversation August 2007, 1970. 32. Lieutenant Colonel George M. Chin, author of the now declassified 2,000-page work The Machine Gun for the Department of the Navy, in a phone conversation August 30th, 1970. 33. U.S. v. Miller, United States Supreme Court, May 15, 1939. 34. Many of the people I have spoken to who had a significant number, 20 or more, of non-taxed NFA weapons and DWATs decided to amnesty register 2 or 3 guns, hedging their bets in case of confiscation. 35. As the law is now being interpreted, the case mentioned before where the gun has never crossed state lines has not yet been tested in court. 36. From current price lists from 6 special occupational taxpayers licensed to deal in these type of weapons. 37. Individual state laws may prohibit ownership. 38. average of several advertised in dealer publications, examples with a documented history, that is a weapon owned and used by Pretty Boy Floyd, command a premium. 39. Police and dealers I questioned were uneasy about estimating the street value of a non-tax Thompson submachine gun. The only dealer who was willing to say anything at all suggested couple $100, tops as an estimate. May 28, 1974. Damn, Ray Johnson thought as the sound of his clients. 375 hours rang out, and he watched a piece of hide fly off the Cape Buffalo's left foreleg. How could he miss at 10 yards? The man lowered the rifle to port arms and stared open-mouthed at the 1,700-pound animal he had just wounded, and consequently made very, very angry. He made no effort to work the bolt and chamber another round. "Shoot! Shoot, damn it!" Ray screamed at his client, who stood frozen, 15 feet to the side of the professional hunter. The buffalo instantly lowered its head, turned towards the cause of his irritation, and charged. The man then did something Ray Johnson had never seen anyone do before. Al Holbrecht turned in panic, dropped his rifle, and ran. Ray Johnson was so stunned at his client's action that he was half a second slow getting the front sight of his. 458 Model 70 on the enraged bull, even though the butt of his rifle was already on his shoulder. The buffalo was passing right to left in front of Raymond's muzzle. The Winchester thundered, and even as he slapped the bolt rearward, Ray knew that by the time he got off a second shot, the adrenaline-filled animal would have overtaken his panicked customer. As Ray simultaneously hauled the rifle down out of recoil with his left hand and slammed the bolt forward with his right, he saw with amazement that the bull was down, 5 or 6 feet past where he had been when Ray pulled the trigger. He was not dead, but his hindquarters were all that would function. Both of the buffalo's shoulders were obviously shattered. Ray put his second shot through the animal's heart and lowered his rifle. He glanced to his left and saw that the steel company president was still running. Hope he stops pretty soon, Raymond thought with a shake of his head. There's a ravine in that direction, less than a mile and a half away. Good shot, his lead tracker said simply as he jogged over to inspect the dead beast. Yeah. It was the first time Ray Johnson had used Henry Bowman's ammo to stop a charge. It would not be the last. Richard Westcott Gaines, the valedictorian announced, and Richard stepped to the podium and took the proffered diploma. A cheer rose from a group of friends seated in folding chairs on the university lawn. "Man, he's got it knocked," one of them said in admiration. "What do you mean? I thought his grades sucked, like almost flunking out." "You didn't hear?" the first asked in surprise. "Some congressman where he lives got him a spot. His GPA doesn't matter." "A job?" "No, not a state senator. What's the other one? A state representative." He laughed. "Get this, he only has to go in 4 days a week from January to May, and he doesn't actually have to do anything except sit around and listen. Not even that, really. Just vote sometimes on stuff. And for 5 months he's getting paid more than I'm going to get in a whole year at Monsanto." "Shit, how do I get a job like that?" "Beats me. Blow somebody, I guess." The two young men stopped discussing Richard Gaines' future when they saw that another of their friends was about to have his name called. In point of fact, Richard Gaines did not yet actually have the state rep position his friends referred to, as the election was not until November. When that time came, however, Congressman Sloan would indeed make good on his promise, and Richard Gaines would represent a district in South St. Louis. The rest of the young man's description of Gaines' future was reasonably accurate, although his estimate of the monetary benefits was on the low side. "Well, I'm going to head back to the hotel until it's time for dinner," Catherine Bowman told her son. "Are there any of your friends that can join us, or do all of them have plans with their parents?" Henry's mother liked being able to include her son's friends when they were available. "Marty's parents have to go do something or other that he wants to avoid like the plague. Let me find him and see if he wants to use us as an excuse to beg off on whatever they've got plotted. I think Jeff's free, too." He looked around the quadrangle at his black-robed classmates, trying to spot either or both of his friends. A number of the graduating seniors had shucked their commencement robes and were sporting purple shirts emblazoned with the slogan, "Right is okay," to show that they weren't ashamed for graduating without writing an honors thesis. Well, you go carouse with your friends for a while, and then give me a call at the hotel and tell me how many so I can phone in the reservations. Henry smiled at his mother's turn of phrase. If you're out, I'll leave word at the front desk, he promised. Oh, and I lugged this up here for you. It just came to the house, and I thought it might be important. Henry's mother opened her purse and withdrew a letter-sized envelope, and Henry smiled at the idea of her lugging it up to Massachusetts for him. When he saw the return address and the absence of postage, his pulse quickened. Department of the Treasury, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, NFA Branch, Washington, D.C. 200226. My Class 3 license, he exclaimed as he tore open the envelope. Thought it might be important, Catherine Bowman commented, deadpan. Henry scanned the enclosed sheet and saw that they had cashed his check, and his status as a special occupational taxpayer would be effective July 1st, the first day of the fiscal year that had been created with the passage of the National Firearms Act in June of 1934. Yes, he said under his breath as he reread the document. First time anyone in our family was excited about mail from the government, his mother said dryly. See you around 7, she said as she kissed him goodbye. Henry Bowman had just graduated with a BA in both geology and economics, and he had 3 firm job offers. The one he expected to accept was with an independent firm outside St. Louis that did a lot of contract work for the oil companies and whose president had complained that his geologists still didn't understand that they've been hired to help the firm make money, not to look for fossilized Indians or some damn thing. At that moment, however, Henry Bowman was not thinking about geology or economics. He was contemplating the fact that he had just been licensed by the feds to deal in machine guns. December 18th, 1974. Henry Bowman was not thinking about guns or shooting as he tossed the bulk rate envelopes in the trash and divided his first-class mail into bills and everything else. He was reviewing in his mind if there was anyone on his Christmas list he had neglected when his telephone rang. Hello. Henry, it's Ed. Glad I caught you. Have you seen the latest shotgun news? Ed Barber was referring to a publication that came out twice a month. It was 96 pages of newsprint, published in Hastings, Nebraska, which was composed entirely of classified and display ads for firearms and firearms-related products. It's here, but I haven't looked at it yet. Well, you better go get it. Some guy's got a 4-bore for sale. What? Henry almost screamed. I think he's a dealer. It's in the classified section under rifles for sale. I don't have my copy in front of me, but it's a Rada. The ad said both barrels were fully rifled and the gun weighed 24 pounds. I'll call you back, Henry said quickly and hung up the phone. It took him 4 minutes to find the most recent copy of Shotgun News, turn to the rifles for sale section and locate the 1-inch ad. RB Rada 4 bore double rifle, 24-pound back-action underlever hammer gun built in 1880 to 1882. Brown Damascus barrels fully rifled mint bores. Beautiful engraving, elephants, rhinos, lion, original case. Some loading tools, not original, serious inquiries only, no collect calls. Jim, 603-217-5543 after 6. Jim. Henry stared at the ad and looked at the date at the top of the page. Damn, I hope this issue hasn't been out long. He was kicking himself for not skimming through it as soon as it had arrived in his mailbox. The Rada was the only 4-bore he had ever seen advertised in the Shotgun News. Hello? The man answered on the 4th ring. Yes, sir, I'm calling about the ad you ran in Shotgun News about a Rada double rifle for sale. Do you still have it, or has it been sold? Well, fellow said he wanted it for sure, but didn't have the money yet. Told him I'd give him till noon on Friday. I see, Henry said. The day after tomorrow. What can you tell me about the gun? Well, it's a full-weight 4. Back-action underlever hammer gun, dual triggers, of course. 24 pounds empty, with 24-inch barrels. Bores are mint, extractor gun. No ejectors, of course. Outside of the barrels, there's a few pits, but the gun's 90+% original finish. Action's tight. You can't pull the barrels off the face. Splinter forend, but on a 4, it's a pretty big splinter, the man said with a laugh. Dark wood, nice straight grain, No figure to speak of. Got a small repair in the grip just back of the tang, but you have to look real close. It was done right, and looks as if it's been that way for a long while. Cheek piece for a right-handed shooter. Pad's been replaced, but I don't know how long ago. Case is original, and has a bunch of real old steamship stickers on it, so the gun's been used in either Africa or India, or both. Leather straps are missing. Got one lathe-turned brass case, some fiber wads, and a bullet mold somebody made up for it a few years ago. Big 2,000 grain conical job. What's the length of pull? I'd have to measure, and it's down in the safe, but the stock hasn't been shortened or lengthened, or anything, if that's what you mean. Have you shot it? Henry asked. Not with full loads, the man admitted. I fired a few rounds with 100 grains of double F. Didn't kick as bad as I thought. No shit, Henry said to himself. The correct load's between 380 and 440 grains of powder, depending on what the gun was regulated for. He took a breath and asked the question, What's the price? It's the best gun I've ever owned, the man on the other end of the line said with a sigh. It was a comment that sellers used as a matter of course, but in this case Henry knew the man was speaking the truth. Henry Bowman felt that the only finer weapon in existence would have to be another 4-bore. I wanted 8,500 for it, the seller continued. This one fellow made me a firm offer of 8,000, and I'm giving him until noon on Friday to get me the money. If he doesn't, and you want it for 8, it's yours. Henry swallowed. Okay, he said after just a moment's hesitation, but I have to have a 1-day inspection. I don't doubt your description. It sounds as if you're very thorough, but I intend to shoot this gun, and if the stock doesn't fit me, I can't take it. I'll call you within an hour after I get the gun to tell you if I'm keeping it, and I'll pay shipping both ways if I send it back. Sounds fair to me. 3-day inspection's normal. I won't need near that long. What's your full name and mailing address, and are there any other phone numbers I should have to reach you at noon on Friday? The man on the other end of the line gave him the information. I'll call you at exactly noon, Henry promised, and hung up. Now I've got to wait until Friday, he thought. December 20th, 1974. Bureau of Standards. Yes, sir. I know you're not the bank, but I've got to set a clock to the exact time. Within a second or two is good enough, and I can't get your radio signal here, Henry said into the phone. Can you help me out? What time zone? Central. It's 17 after 10 and about 40 seconds. Hang with me, and I'll give you when it hits 18 after. Thanks. I'll wait. Henry had stopped his watch with the second hand on the 12 before he made the call. Now he adjusted the minute hand to show 18 after 10 and prepared to push in the stem to restart the timepiece. Right now. Got it. Thanks a lot. Henry broke the connection. Shut that fucking kid up, Boone Caswell commanded. He liked to stay in bed on Sundays after a night of heavy drinking. Boone looked at the clock beside the bed. 6:30. Christ, it's too goddamn early in the morning for this shit. He turned over in the bed, but it was no use the crying bored into his brain, making his hangover even worse. Myra, can't you shut her up? Caswell climbed out of bed naked and marched into the living room. His 4-year-old daughter Cindy sat on the couch, trembling as she cried. She wanted to tell her parents that she'd just had a terrible nightmare. When she saw she had succeeded in summoning her father, she increased the volume. To Boone Caswell, it seemed as if a hot steel needle were being thrust into his brain. Shut the fuck up, he bellowed and delivered a vicious slap across Cindy's face. The blow knocked her sideways on the couch. It was the first time Boone Caswell had ever struck his daughter, and his action had the opposite of the intended result. Cindy screamed even more loudly. Nonetheless, Boone Caswell was smiling when he returned to his bedroom. At 5 seconds past 11 local time, Henry Bowman made the call. Hello? Good afternoon. Henry Bowman in St. Louis calling again. About the Rada. Please tell me it hasn't been sold. Yeah, hey, I got your cashier's check this morning. Didn't know you were going to overnight it to me. Nice of you to put in an extra 40 for shipping, too. Lots of folks always want the seller to pay for it. Did the other guy come through? Henry asked quickly. Haven't heard from him. There was a pause. Yeah, my clock says it's a couple minutes after noon. So it's mine? Unless you change your mind when you see it. I mean, if this other guy shows up as soon as we hang up, and he's got $8,000 and $100 bills in his hand, it's still my gun, right? Henry repeated. The man on the other end laughed. That's how I do business. I gave him till noon. It's past that time. His money isn't here and yours is. You bought yourself a 4-bore double rifle, mister. Been looking for one, I take it? For 15 years, Henry said with feeling. As it turned out, Henry Bowman had not needed to call Fort Collins to get the exact time. The other man who had wanted the gun did not contact the owner of the big rifle to tell him he'd rounded up the money until almost 12:30, and when he did, it was over the phone and not in person. He was very upset to learn that the gun had been sold, but as a serious buyer, he played by the rules and knew that the roles could have been reversed. The seller called Henry and suggested waiting until after Christmas before dropping the package off at the UPS office. Henry Bowman reluctantly agreed to this sensible recommendation. December 30th, 1974. Oh my God, Henry thought when he lifted the lid of the 90-year-old fitted oak and leather trunk case and pushed aside the newspaper that had been used to cushion the contents. The rifle, which lay inside, had seen substantial use, but it had been well cared for considering it had been built for hard service. The quality of the workmanship was superb. And the size, Henry marveled. It was just as he remembered in the photo Al Goodman had shown him years ago. The overall length of the Rada was no greater than his, 577 Rigby, but it was much more massive. Henry Bowman lifted the barrels out of their felt-lined compartment, swung the forend lever to the side, and removed the forend. He examined the bores. They were mint, as promised, and huge. He stuck his thumb in the muzzle of one, the right barrel. It didn't even touch both sides. They're so big I could almost... Well, not quite, Henry thought. He hung the barrels from a piece of string and wrapped them with a wooden ruler. They rang like a big gong. He laid the barrels on the carpet, lifted the stocked receiver out of the case, and swung the big underlever to the side. He picked up the barrels, fitted them to the breech, and swung them shut while returning the underlever to its original position. Then he fitted the forend iron to the barrels and locked it in place with the forend lever. He cocked the hammers and stuffed a sock in between their noses and the firing pins, then tested both triggers. They broke cleanly with no trace of creep, with a rather heavy pull, Henry was pleased to note. Henry stood up, closed his eyes, and threw the 24-pound rifle to his shoulder with one fluid motion. When he opened his eyes, the front sight bead was resting in the V-notch of the 50-yard rear leaf. The stock would not have fit Henry any better if he had been the original owner for whom the gun was built. He was grinning like an idiot as he carried the big rifle over to the end of the couch and picked up the telephone. January 25th, 1975. I don't think you really need 25, but I got them all done, Kurt Benke said, as he let Henry Bowman in the back door of his basement workshop. I know you're champing at the bit to go fire that monster. Matter of fact, I'd like to watch. Henry followed the gunsmith over to his cluttered workbench. Benke reached into a box and pulled out a polished brass cartridge case, 4 inches long and about 1 1/4 inches in diameter, which he handed to Henry. Only a handful of makers in England had ever made 4-bore rifles, and each firm's guns used ammunition that was specific to that manufacturer. Henry had never intended to even look for the correct original ammunition for his gun. Even if it could be located, 100-year-old ammo loaded with black powder would not likely still deliver original ballistics. If it did, it would still be too valuable to collectors to justify shooting it up. Henry had obtained a 10-foot length of 1 3/8 inches round brass bar stock, and cut it in half so he could get it in Kurt Benke's basement. Benke had used his power hacksaw and lathe to make 25 cases that exactly fit Henry's gun. Cut the primer pocket for 50 machine gun primers like you wanted, but I think a shotgun primer would have been plenty, Benke opined as he went to his safe and retrieved the barrels to Henry's Rada. 400 grains of FG black is a lot to light off, Henry replied as he dropped the oiled case into the right chamber. It fit perfectly. He extracted it and tried it in the left one with the same results. Near as I could tell with my inside mics, the chambers are within a couple tenths of each other, the gunsmith said. When did you say that gun was made? 1880, Henry answered. Little more precision work involved than on an 1873 liver action. He said with an upraised eyebrow, 440 in agreement, then moved over to his lathe. Here's the shell holder I made, and here's your neck sizing die, your seating punch, and your crimp die, all threaded 1.5" 12 for that Hollywood press of yours. You sure it's got enough leverage? It sizes my 20 millimeters cannon brass, okay? Henry pointed out. Oh, right. Kurt Benke periodically seemed to forget about some of the larger guns that Henry Bowman owned and used. He himself did not own a rifle larger than .30 caliber, although that would change after his 70th birthday, when continued exposure to Henry Bowman's enthusiasm for elephant guns would prompt Benke to build one for himself. Henry inspected the handmade loading tools. They were flawlessly machined. How much do I owe you? He asked. Benke looked pained. I've got over 40 hours in all this stuff. I've got to have 300. He did not let on, but he still thought of Henry Bowman as the 10-year-old who had first come into the basement workshop with his father in 1963. You take cash on Saturdays? Henry asked as he reached into his pocket. It was an old joke. If that's all you got, the older man replied, deadpan. You busy tomorrow, Kurt, or would you like to watch me break my collarbone? I'm going out to the range to see how it shoots, Henry said as he handed over the bills. I'll be there by 8:30, Benke grinned. January 26, 1975. Here goes nothing, Henry Bowman said as he pulled the butt into his shoulder, tightened his grip on the forend, leaned forward, and squeezed the front trigger with his right index finger. He had placed a large, heavy wooden crate on top of the concrete shooting bench and a cheap, loosely rolled sleeping bag on top of the crate. The sleeping bag was in such a position that Henry could rest his left forearm on it while holding the rifle and standing straight up. It was how he shot double rifles for accuracy, for it allowed support while permitting the gun to recoil in the same way that it would when fired offhand. This was important for double rifles, for unlike single-barrel rifles, the axis of each bore on a double was to the side of the axis of recoil, not in line with it. If a double rifle were shot off sandbags, it would shoot to a different point of impact than when it was fired offhand. The trigger broke at 16 pounds, and the huge rifle rocked Henry's body backwards about 10 degrees as a deep whoom rattled the galvanized roof over the firing line. The large cloud of white smoke which had belched out of the gun's muzzle began to drift away in the wind. Henry lowered the rifle and looked at Kurt Benke. Not bad at all. I could shoot that load all day. Of course, it wasn't a full charge. Both men stared downrange at the 50-yard target butt. No problem spotting your shots with that gun, Benke said immediately as he hopped from one foot to the other in the cold weather. The 1-inch bullet hole was very easy to see with the naked eye at the 50-yard distance. Henry had used black spray paint, butcher paper, and a paper plate to stencil a black ring for a target. His shot was 2 inches outside the black at 2 o'clock, which put it about 8 inches right of center and 3 inches high. He cocked the left hammer and took aim again, this time squeezing the rear trigger. The big gun boomed again, and this shot was a mirror image of the first shot, on the left side of the target. The two holes were at the same height, spaced about 15 inches apart. Ha! Henry yelled with pleasure when he saw where his second shot had gone. That's good? The bench-rest gunsmith and record holder asked dubiously. 15 inches apart for 2 shots at 50 yards was good for a bow and arrow maybe, but not any rifle Benke would want to own. Elevation's identical and the barrels are shooting apart and high with a load that's too light. That's a real good sign. The gun starts recoiling as soon as the primer goes off. With a lighter powder charge, there's more time between when the primer ignites and when the bullet leaves the muzzle. That means the right barrel should shoot right and high, and the left barrel should shoot left and high. That's the theory, at least. Remember the engineer's creed. When the results don't agree with the theory, believe the results and come up with a new theory, the gunsmith answered. Right. Let's see what results we get when we up the powder charge 50 grains. Kurt Benke winced. Bench rest shooters fired cartridges which held around 25 grains total. A 300 Magnum case held 3 times that. A cartridge where the shooter might elect to increase his powder charge by 50 grains was an assault on Benke's sensibilities. What load were you shooting? he managed to ask. 300 grains of single EFE, because this gun weighs a full 24 pounds. I suspect it was regulated for the full 16 dram charge. That's 1 ounce, or 438 grains. The next pair I'll shoot is a 350 grain charge, same bullet. What's your bullet weight? The slugs I'm shooting weigh 2,140 grains out of linotype metal. Some of these old guns were regulated for a round ball cast out of pure lead, which would weigh 1,750 grains. Most of them were set up for conical bullets, though, as near as I can determine. If it still shoots apart with the 440 grain charge, I'll have to shoot lighter bullets. Kurt Benke watched as Henry extracted the fired cases and replaced them with another pair. He did not ask Henry if he had brought ammunition loaded with the 440 grain charge he had mentioned. He believed he already knew the answer. The report of the next 2 shots was noticeably different. It was both louder and sharper, and the older man could see that the gun recoiled with more vigor. On the second shot, he watched the target instead of the shooter, and was startled to see a large quantity of dirt and ice from the backstop thrown 20 feet in the air behind the target frame. The holes in the paper were 8 inches apart, spaced equally on either side of center, and an inch high. Looks like your theory is holding up. Nice not to need a spotting scope, don't you think? Recoil still okay? It's definitely getting heavier. Notice the difference in the sound? Those two were supersonic. 1,100 feet per second? Benke said immediately. For some reason, it had not occurred to him that the huge bullets could be driven that fast out of a gun which could still be fired from the shoulder. We're not done yet. Here comes 400 grains. Henry pushed his earplugs in a little deeper, reloaded the Rada, and rested his arm against the rolled sleeping bag. He made a conscious effort to grip the gun as tightly as possible. The recoil, while still manageable, was unlike that of any other weapon he had ever used, and he didn't want to drop the gun. This time, the report sounded to Henry like standing next to a tree as it was struck by lightning. A 1-inch hole appeared in the paper less than 2 inches right of center and dead on for elevation. Henry cocked the left hammer and took aim again. His second shot was a little higher than his first, and a little over 3 inches left of it. How high you going to go? The older man asked. I loaded some at 440, Henry replied. I'll clean the gunk out of the barrels and give 'em a go. He swung the underlever to the side, broke the gun open, emptied it, and laid it on a blanket on the next shooting bench. Henry Bowman picked up an aluminum shotgun cleaning rod with a 12-gauge brush screwed in the end and wrapped a large piece of rag around the bristles. He sprayed the cloth liberally with WD-40, sprayed more into the breech of the right barrel, and shoved the rod down the bore from the breech. When the wrapped brush emerged from the muzzle, it was thoroughly caked with shiny black carbon residue. Henry inspected the bore, then used a new piece of rag to repeat the process with the other barrel. There's a lot of it, but it seems to come right out. I think the Alox and beeswax bullet lube I'm using may be an improvement over what the Brits had 100 years ago, Henry said. Although it wouldn't surprise me if they had something just as good or better, he amended after a moment's reflection. Fresh target this time, Henry said as he removed 2 big cartridges from the bag he had labeled 440 and loaded the gun. He wiped the fog from his shooting glasses and assumed the position at the standing rest. This time he made an effort to put his feet a little farther back so that he would be leaning into the gun a little more. The blast was tremendous, and recoil rocked Henry back until the muzzles of his rifle were pointing up at about a 45-degree angle. Henry brought the gun down out of recoil and cocked the left hammer. He settled back into the bag and locked into position again as he switched his index finger to the rear trigger. It looks like The sound of the second shot cut off Kurt Benke's comment about where Henry's first shot had gone. Henry laid the gun down on the blanket, and both men squinted off into the distance. Almost touching, the older man said with admiration in his voice. Let me put 2 more of the same load in there, see if they fall in the same group. Henry had loaded 4 rounds each with 400 and 440 grain charges and 8 rounds of 300 and 350 grain loadings. He replaced the fired cases with his 2 remaining rounds that carried the heaviest charge. Kurt Benke stepped several paces to the side and held a camera trained on his friend. Benke was braced against one of the roof supports, for he knew the blast would jar a freehand hold. At the shot, the gunsmith tripped the shutter, catching Henry in full recoil. Henry Bowman recovered, cocked the left hammer, and let drive with the second barrel. He looked over at his 59-year-old companion. "Doesn't look too bad," he opined. The target showed two pairs of overlapping holes with about an inch of space between them. Elevation was perfect. Benke stared at the target butt. "You going to raise the charge again?" he asked uncertainly. The barrels were obviously very close to regulating perfectly. "I think I'll lower the bullet weight instead. Could you take an eighth of an inch off the base in the lathe without too much trouble?" "Yeah, sure. Put 'em in the collet, Chuck. I could give you a half dozen each of several different weights. You don't need 1,000 or anything like that, do you?" Both men broke into laughter at that idea. Henry wiped down the rata and laid it on the blanket. "I think I'll give my central nervous system a rest for a while. Shall we shoot some varmint rifles? 300 yards, 5 groups averaged for record. Loser buys lunch." "What kind of a handicap do I have to give you?" Benke asked cautiously. "None. I'm in too good a mood about my 4-bore. Kurt Benke just smiled. When they were finished shooting, Kurt Benke had an average group size of 1.42. All his groups were nearly round. Henry's groups had a little over an inch of vertical dispersion, but on that gusty January day the horizontal spread averaged almost 4 inches. His targets were what Kurt Benke liked to refer to as weather reports. Henry Bowman was still grinning when he picked up the check for a late lunch. February 22nd, 1977. "Hey!" the man yelled out across the office, his hand covering the mouthpiece of the telephone he held. Sloan just had a massive cerebral hemorrhage, dead as a hammer in Washington. His friend sat bolt upright. His mind was racing, and he was already thinking several steps ahead to the special election that would have to be held to replace the dead congressman. "Carter's only been in office a month. Maybe we can make some hay on this one." "Some other well-intentioned guy out of left field, you mean?" He began to smile. The idea was definitely appealing. "Somebody we can control?" His smile grew broader, then his brows furrowed. "Got to be someone white, though. Might backfire if we try to sneak in another Clay," he warned. The second man nodded at this assessment. There were limits, after all. The goal was to always expand them. "Yeah," he said, nodding his head. "What we need is somebody who can tell people what they want to hear and doesn't have some stupid agenda that can get us into trouble." "Shit, that doesn't narrow the field much." "Yeah, but somebody young and good-looking, and who can smile without looking like Eleanor Roosevelt, so the voters will want to pay more taxes." "Makes it harder." Suddenly the two men's heads snapped towards each other. "Dick Gaines," they said in unison. Missouri's next U.S. congressman for the 3rd District had just been chosen. April 9th, 1978. "I won't ask what was going through your mind when you signed this," the senior accountant from Ernst & Winnie said with a smile as he took the check and placed it with the other documents for delivery to the IRS. "Please don't." Henry Bowman's face was utterly without expression, and his tone of voice told the accountant he wanted no further discussion. "You need me for anything else?" "No, I think we're all set. Then I'll be going." Henry turned on his heel and left the office. The entire way home, Henry Bowman thought about just how much he had come to despise both the socialist policies his country's government had adopted and the people who had forced those policies on the public. Isn't that why this nation was formed? To get sway from this very thing, he asked himself over and over. As Henry walked into the kitchen, he hung his jacket over the back of a chair. The house still didn't feel right to him, with his mother gone. Every time he walked through a doorway, he half expected to see her, especially after being away on a job for several days. Catherine Bowman had died very suddenly of a heart attack almost a year before, while carrying a box of plants from her station wagon to the pantry off the kitchen. She was 61 years old. Henry had moved out of his apartment and back into the house he had grown up in to undertake the arduous task of settling his mother's estate. The 55% haircut appalled him. Henry Bowman had known that taxes would be bad, but losing over half of everything his parents owned was a shock. Estates of less than $175,000 were not taxed. Above that figure, taxes quickly rose to a staggering 77% on estates of over $10 million. The law allowed 9 months to come up with the money, which meant selling a lot of things. Henry had reluctantly come to the conclusion that keeping the family summer property would mean selling all the stocks and bonds, and the country place was maintenance intensive. Without income from savings to maintain it, Henry had seen that its upkeep would bankrupt him. It was now being subdivided for development, and the entire proceeds from the sale, along with his mother's entire bond portfolio and much of the stocks, had just gone to the IRS. And the estate tax program doesn't even break even, Henry thought with disgust. He had scarcely believed it when the accountant told him, but it made sense. Very few people saved $175,000 in property and other assets. Estates of those few people who conserved and invested their assets successfully enough to rise above this level generated less taxes than the costs of administration. The estate tax wasn't there to help pay for things the country needed. It was there to prevent Americans from passing their property and their savings on to their descendants. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. That's what Andrew Carnegie said. Henry closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He did not like feeling angry like this. He opened the door to the basement stairs, flicked on the light switch, and descended the steps to the woodworking shop that Walter Bowman had built and that had been Henry's for the last decade. The smell relaxed him immediately. Henry went to the partially finished gunstock that was clamped in the padded jaws of the bench vise. He ran his hand over the Bastogne walnut, taking in the wonderful scent of his favorite wood. The Enfield action barreled in. 500 Miller lay on the bench behind the stock. This one's going to be pure poison when I get too tired to carry my rod, Henry thought. Design weight for the 5-shot magazine rifle was 101 halves pounds. It would fire a 600 grain, 510 bullet at 2,400 feet per second, as opposed to the 458, which threw a smaller 500 grain slug at 2,258. As a 458 offering sent the same bullet FPS. The unfinished rifle made Henry think about his impending safari to Rhodesia, and his spirits lifted considerably. Gotta get this stock finished if I want to practice any before I go. His Rhodesian safari was scheduled for the entire month of September. Henry Bowman lifted an artist's paintbrush out of a small pot of oil and lampblack and gave the underside of the barreled receiver a thin coat of the wet mix. Then he lowered the metalwork into the stock, pressed it firmly, and lifted it out again. Henry inspected the wood closely, looking at every place that was blackened where the metal had touched it. About 75% contact. He shook his head. Abe and Van Horn wouldn't settle for 75%, Henry said to himself, referring to the stockmakers whose work he most admired. He chose a round-end scraper from several dozen that were in a rack on his bench and went to work. Have the people in this country lost their minds? Congressman Gaines demanded. His aide knew better than to answer questions such as that and remained silent. Listen to this. All across the country, a disturbing trend is taking shape. Americans are stockpiling food and rediscovering home canning in preparation for what they see as the inevitable result of runaway inflation, unchecked government spending, and the abdication of U.S. strength and respect abroad. The debate about the Panama Canal is but one of many examples of what these citizens view as a drastically weakened foreign policy, with ultimate consequences much more serious than mere loss of pride. These people call themselves survivalists, and they are not wringing their hands, they are taking action. Survivalists are learning mechanical skills. They are storing massive amounts of consumables, not only food, but diesel fuel, gasoline, and goods for barter. They are planting large vegetable gardens and digging wells on their own property. Any money they have left after these large purchases of basic necessities is used to buy gold. These measures are the only protection survivalists feel they can give their families in the event that economic disaster does come to pass. He put down the magazine and stared across the lunch table at his subordinate. What kind of crap is this? He asked rhetorically. Richard Gaines had been reading a national news magazine, quoting from one of the many current articles describing a phenomenon which was occurring all across the country. Suddenly he thought of something. I thought it was illegal to buy gold. Ah, Gerald Ford changed that when he was an office congressman. That fool, Gaines sneered. The aide did not point out to the young congressman that gold had been the underlying asset for the world's major monetary systems for thousands of years, and it was Franklin Roosevelt, with a huge majority in both Congress and the Senate, who had unhitched the currency from its anchor and made it a federal crime for U.S. citizens to own this basic store of value. That happened in 1934, a year that saw other federal proposals with far-reaching implications for the American public become law. What can we do about this? Gaines demanded. His aide opened his mouth to speak, but realized he hadn't the vaguest idea what the congressman was after. Strengthen foreign policy? Not much the young congressman could do there. Pledged to introduce no legislation unless it repealed spending programs? It would be interesting to see how his constituents reacted to that. The aide shrugged in reply. Richard Gaines was obviously pondering his own question. I could introduce a bill prohibiting ownership of more than, say, a month's worth of basic necessities. Exemption for bona fide producers, of course, farmers and all that. Go through the records of all the bulk sellers, look for individual purchasers. Any excess food they've got over the 1-month limit, take it and put it into a government-administered fund, to be sold at below-market rates to the people who are below the poverty line. That'd look good to the public, make these crazy end-of-the-world types give their food to people who really need it. He chewed his lip, thinking. Couldn't do the same thing very easily with gas or diesel, so we'd have a line in there prohibiting home storage. Make it a crime to have more than 10 gallons aside from what was in your car and lawn mower. Underground tanks would have to be filled in. Richard Gaines was pondering other elements of his bill when a large, weathered hand was laid on his shoulder. Son, I just finished eating dinner at the next table, and I couldn't help but hear you telling your friend about this idea of yours for a bill. The speaker was a large man with white hair, in his 70s or early 80s. Before you get your secretary to type it up for you, I think you might want to reread the Constitution, because right now you got several problems that are going to come up and bite you, like that plan you got to take what people's been hoarding, put it in a government fund. Going to run smack into the Fifth Amendment, I'm afraid, taking property like that without compensation. Now, finding out who to take it from, that's going to butt heads with the Fourth Amendment. That's the one about unreasonable search and seizure, case you forgot. Might even get some squawk on the 10th Amendment, though that one's a little shaky. Anyway, thought you might want to think about those things a bit before you start figuring that since the Constitution was written a couple hundred years ago by some fellows who dressed and talked kind of funny, it's not of much interest except to college. Professors writing about ancient history. He chuckled as he thought of something. Last fellow in this town who felt that way got in a whole mess of trouble, you may recall. The man lifted his hand from Gaines' shoulder, nodded once, and walked towards the exit. Who the hell was that old goat? Gaines asked his aide when the older man had left the restaurant. The stranger had been exactly right in his assumption about the young congressman's view of the Constitution, and it irritated Gaines to be talked to like someone in grade school. Senator Sam Ervin. He eats in here sometimes. Retired 4 years ago after he finished up his job as chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. The aide saw Gaines' blank look and continued. You know the Watergate hearings? Ended up with Nixon resigning? Oh, yeah. I thought I'd seen him somewhere before, Gaines said. Look, the aide said to his boss, wanting to get him back in good humor and recognizing how to do it. What he said about the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, that's true as far as it goes, but that's only a problem when you try to do what you want head on. What do you mean? Well, the aide said, as he chewed a bite of steak and gestured with his fork, when you try to pass progressive laws and do what's best for the country, a lot of times the people will resist. At least when you try to do too much too fast. You know about the Fabian Society in England? Gaines shook his head. The aide smiled and took a deep breath. He loved political history and didn't get to talk about it often enough. Here was a chance to look good for the boss. Fabian Society was a political organization founded in the 1880s in Great Britain. Their ultimate goal was to establish a socialist government in England. They knew if they came out and said that, though, their ideas would be rejected immediately by the majority of people. So they began to gradually educate the public by publishing essays that explained the benefits of socialist ideas. And they framed their ideas in terms that would appeal to the influential upper class, because those are usually the people that can get things done. Anyway, because of that strategy, they were very successful. They were the major force behind the Labor Representation Committee that was founded at the turn of the century. He saw Gaines's blank look and added, "The LRC was what became England's Labour Party." So, Gaines asked, he didn't see where this was going, and he was getting bored with talk about England. So they got what the Fabians had always wanted, the aide said hurriedly. At least a lot of it. The Labour Party won by a landslide in 45, and Prime Minister Attlee was able to finally create a welfare state in England, which was a real coup. Within 2 years, they had free medical care for everyone. The government owned the Bank of England, and they'd let India, Pakistan, Ceylon, and Burma go. Within 5 or 6 years, they had nationalized a quarter of the country's industry. The aide did not mention that these policies resulted in a massive trade deficit, subsequent food rationing, and drastic devaluation of the pound sterling. It went without saying that in all socialist endeavors, certain inconveniences had to be tolerated by individuals for the greater good of the public as a whole. The aide's eyes were bright as he stared at the congressman. It never could have happened all at once, and that's what I think we need to keep in mind. So 50 years, is that what you're telling me? Gaines asked with irritation. No, not at all, the aide said quickly, shaking his head vigorously. We got our welfare state over 40 years ago. And what you were just talking about, wanting to ban hoarding and distribute the survivalist food to the poor, you don't have to listen to that old asshole preach about how your law would violate the Constitution. You don't even need to pass a new law at all. We've already got the power. What do you mean? Gaines asked. The Emergency Powers Act gives the president the authority to do whatever he wants in a time of national emergency. It was meant to be invoked in the event of a nuclear war, but there's nothing in it that specifies that particular circumstance. If the president wants to, he can use it. Order the army to seize all the people's stockpiles of food, diesel fuel, gold, guns, whatever, nationwide curfew, censor the press, you name it, he can do it under the Emergency Powers Act. Money, too. If the president says no taking money out of the country, even a few $100s, boom, it's a crime. Freeze bank accounts, seize assets, anything he wants. So we've got the authority already, but it takes special circumstances, huh? I guess the next step is to make the circumstances less unusual, right? Gaines said. That's it, his aide replied with a grin. The people won't give up the things they think they are entitled to if you try to take them all at once. You need to start with something that sounds so innocuous that you can ridicule anyone that opposes you. Then expand it. Do what the Fabian Society did, treat it just as you would a salami, a slice at a time. The congressional aide was well versed in his political history, but he was ignorant of the National Firearms Act of 1934. If he had been familiar with this particular piece of legislation, however, he could have used it as a textbook example of the strategy he was advocating.